Welcome back. We will continue talking about using the MIPS stack. This time we're going to focus on subroutine sum2, which has the protocol that the parameters must be passed on the stack and returned, and the result is returned in V0. So remember, the stack is in memory. The register SP contains the address of the top of the stack. Remember also that there's two actions you perform on the stack. One is to push a new value, which means you must change the stack pointer by moving it to an empty spot. That's done by subtracting 4. Then you must store a value into memory using the stack pointer as the base address. That's how you do a push. Now the thing you must be careful about here is that you're pushing two values, and the order in which you take things off the stack is the reverse of your putting them on. So therefore, it makes sense that I must first, oops, that I must first got to push, I must push the second parameter on first, so that the stack will look like V2, val2. And then I must push on the first one, val1. So there are two push operations that must be performed before you make the call. Check. Once I arrive or enter subroutine sum2, the parameters must be taken off the stack. So these are some pops. So the first thing you're going to do is take value 1 and put it into a register. And then you must take value 1. Then you got to take val 2 and put it into a register. This is the popping action. That's what's required. Really, it's not that complicated as long as you understand that when I enter sum2, my parameters are not in registers. I must take them off the stack. So let's take a look at what the code looks like. I'm looking for add sum2. Now again, the documentation for sum2 says that inside the function I'm going to use A1 and A2. A1 is going to be the first parameter. A2 is going to be the second one. And once I retrieve the parameters by popping, all I do is add the two values together, store them in V0, and return. And the subroutine is completed. It's really straightforward. Now let's take a look at our other subroutine, add 4. Because add 4 is kind of a doozy in that add 4 must call two subroutines. It makes this call and it makes this call. Now, the thing that we talked about last week was if a subroutine calls another subroutine, the return address from the first subroutine gets lost when you call the second one. So before the calling subroutine calls another, it's got to save the return address. And we save it by pushing it onto the stack. By now we know what that means. We change the stack pointer by -4 to bring it down to an empty spot, and then we store what's in a register into memory at that location. The register we want to save is RA. And once we've done that, we can go ahead and take care of all these calls. Because what we've ensured is that we have a way to get back home. This is like ET, if you know what I'm talking about. This is your link back to home. Then we carry on the calls to the other subroutines in the way that they must be called. I've got to call add to the way that I'm supposed to call add to, which is described above. When I call sum to, how does sum to work? Well, let's take a look at sum to. Sum to, I've got my stuff all crossed up here. My bad, I've got so many errors here. This should say B, of course. No, this is okay. Oh, heck. Come on, man. All right. This should say what? The last parameter I pass is my first one that I push. I push them in reverse order. So that's what we got to do. So back to add 4. Add 4 has got to save its own return address before making any of these calls. And before it leaves, there's a corresponding pop. There's a push for my return address. I've got to save it. Then before I leave the subroutine, I got to restore it. So I'm using the top value on the stack, and I'm putting it into my return address register. I'm clearing the stack, and I'm jumping to the address in the return register. Again, most of these things are pretty straightforward. Before you try to work on your program, I suggest that you take this and play with it. Make sure you're convinced that things are working the way that you do. Be aware when a subroutine call enters, it's the responsibility of that subroutine to not to leave any stray things on the stack and not to remove store more than it put on the stack. So you got to be careful about that. All right, that ends